Because my mom was born with a rare heart condition, she had been in and out of hospitals her whole life. She had a mild heart attack many years ago, but this one was so massive that the doctor said she would not live out the day. Her heart stopped twice in the ambulance on the way to the hospital, but they were able to revive her. With all of this, we braced ourselves for the worst. My mother was always a natural beauty, but now her beautiful light mocha skin color had become an ominous bluish gray. She was on a ventilator, and her face and body were swollen beyond recognition. But as bad as it looked, I still prayed for a miracle. My mother and I were out of state when this all happened, so towards the end of the day, I was so exhausted that I left the hospital and headed towards a relative's house nearby to take a much-needed nap. While I was sleeping, I heard a voice say, "Get up and call Miss Baker collect." During that time, there were no cell phones, so calling someone collect meant that the person you're calling would accept all the charges. Miss Baker was a close family friend back in our hometown who had a strong prophetic gifting. She moved and operated in the gift of the word of knowledge and prophecy. Now, I thought that the voice I had heard was coming from my own thoughts, even though I wasn't thinking about Miss Baker before I went to sleep. So I brushed it off, turned over, and went back to sleep. Again, I heard a voice, but this time it was much stronger. I said, "Get up and call Miss Baker collect." This time, I knew it was the voice of the Lord, and I obeyed. Miss Baker picked up the phone after the first ring and quickly accepted the charges. She acted as if she knew I was going to call her. She had already heard that my mother had a heart attack, so she went right into what she had to say. She said, "I was sitting by the window praying for your mother, and God gave me a message for her. So this is what you need to do. Go back to the hospital and whisper these words in her ear." The voice of the living God came from heaven and said, "Harden not your heart. If you harden your heart, you'll lose your life. But if you surrender to me completely, you'll live." At that time, my mother was not a Christian and had been running from God for many years. I reminded Miss Baker that my mother was totally unconscious and would not hear anything I'd say. She said my mother's spirit would indeed hear me, and she would be able to choose life or death. She then firmly told me to go and do it quickly. When I entered the intensive care unit, the doctor and nurse were in my mother's room. The doctor told me that her condition had worsened and even showed me an x-ray of her extremely enlarged heart. As I looked at the x-ray, the hope that I had on the way to the hospital gave way to fear. After the doctor and nurse left the room, I looked at my dear mother who was struggling to live. I leaned over her and whispered in her ear as I was told to do so. "Mommy, the voice of the living God came from heaven and said, 'Harden not your heart. If you harden your heart, you'll lose your life. But if you surrender to me completely, you'll live.'" Immediately, my mother opened her eyes wide and then closed them. Her spirit had heard me just as Miss Baker said. I yelled for the doctor to come and told him that my mother had just opened her eyes. He didn't believe me at first, but after he tapped her shoulder while calling her name, she opened her eyes again. Both the doctor and nurse were in shock. This was the first time she responded to stimuli since she had the attack. This was indeed a mighty breakthrough, and I knew that my mother had chosen to surrender her heart to God. Her spirit had indeed heard me and responded. I began praising God for his miracle-working power. As the nurse was leaving the room, she turned around and said to me, "Oh, I forgot to tell you that a Miss Baker called the hospital, and she wanted me to tell you to call her collect when you get a chance." I smiled and told the nurse that I had already done so. This was confirmation that the voice I heard was indeed the voice of the Lord. My mother made a full recovery, committed her life to Christ, and lived 10 more years before going home to be with the Lord. During those 10 years, she told everybody she knew and everybody she met how God raised her from the dead.